Lord of the Rings and the Game of Thrones are very different stories, and this makes sense because their authors were very different people. Tolkien a Christian, Martin a nihilist, and this has implications for the ways that their stories work themselves out mythologically. In the Game of Thrones, the world is operated by divine chaos, gods of good and evil battling against each other, if they exist. In Lord of the Rings, it's the exact opposite. We find a good God who has ordered creation and desires to turn all things, even evil, into good towards their better ends. So let's see how these philosophies and these mythological substructures work themselves out in the concrete realities of the narrative. Welcome to the Belfast Podcast. My name is Daniel Lee, and today we are going to be talking about Lord of the Rings and Game of Thrones, yet again. And this time we're going to be zooming in a little bit closer on specifics within the stories. Not zooming in all the way. We're going to do some analysis of characters later, which I'm really looking forward to. Today, we're going to be thinking about the mythology of the worlds that Tolkien and Martin build. And specifically, the way that they depict the divine in their worlds. And you may think, if you've read or watched Lord of the Rings, there isn't really a lot to do with the divine in that particular story. There are gods all over the place in Westeros in Game of Thrones. And so it's a little bit more overt there. But Tolkien actually has a whole mythology operating behind the world that he builds that he doesn't actually let come to the fore in the Lord of the Rings itself. It actually is mainly in the Silmarillion, and so this book right here, I'll be reading some from it in a little bit. But anyway, so we're going to be diving into that topic and trying to explore the tensions between what Tolkien paints in one story and then what Martin paints in his story, and using that as a way of exploring the philosophies of these authors and what it is that they're trying to say, maybe about our own world. So a few of the things that we're going to hit over the course of this episode, we're going to think about providence and the clarity of providence and prophecy, communication with the gods. How do you tell what the gods or the god is up to or doing, and the way that manifests itself in the story. Moral clarity. Is there a real good and a real evil, which we've already talked about a little bit, but we'll look at some of the ways that this displays itself in the story. And then we'll think about focusing on that, the nature of these divine beings. Is it kind of a typical way that we now in the West think of good and evil, or at least did maybe 100 years ago, where good and evil are genuinely opposite and mutually exclusive, despite the fact that there may be some struggle, as I've been talking about with Lord of the Rings, to actually accomplish the good? Or is there this kind of blended Manichaeanism, and I'll define that term in a little bit, a push and pull against good and evil, against each other, and that not just happening down here, but in the concrete realities of the world, but also happening in the realm of the divine? Are there good and divine beings who are fighting, warring against each other, and that has maybe some effect down here on us? And so we'll start today by looking at Game of Thrones, then we'll transition to looking at the world that Tolkien builds. One of the things that I in particular want us to think about first, though, I want to talk about that term Manichaeanism. So Manichaeanism is a Christian heresy, a Gnostic heresy. Lots of big words, so I'll try and define. Gnosticism was this idea that matter is bad and spirit is good, and so all of matter was created by kind of a lesser god who trapped souls within matter, and he thought that this was a good thing. He was kind of naive, but the true Father God has come to earth in the form of Jesus, right? In order to pull us out of the world. And so there are some ways that you can read, particularly some things in the Gospels and in Paul, in that light. There are also some Gnostic texts that were not accepted by any of the church councils, and so this was a heresy in the early church. But one of the biggest innovations of Manichaeanism was that it was very influenced by kind of a Persian dualism. Again, not necessarily important for you to know, but this sense in which the cosmos is made up of light and dark, and these things are pushing against each other constantly. And we get caught up in this battle between light and dark, and the pushing and pulling that happens there. And as we participate in that, the tide can turn. But ultimately, these gods, as they battle, they push between darkness and light, death and life. And so that's a tension that we see in a lot of mythologies, even the Christian mythology, the story that Christianity is entrenched within. And so, but the way that Christianity plays it out is a little different. The way that Tolkien plays it out in his story is a little different than the way that Martin plays it out in his story. So before we get too much further, I want to play a clip from a video that's talking about the history of Westeros. This is kind of a nerdy, history of some kind of fantasy world video that I found on YouTube that's really, really good. And he's going to dive into a lot of particular things in the history over the course of this maybe 2 to 3 minute clip that not all of the details are super important, but one of the things that I want you to notice as we look at it is he's talking about the forces of light and dark and the way that they're played off against each other. And he's talking about all of the different religions, or maybe not all of, but a significant amount of the different religions that exist within the story that Martin has crafted for us. And so I want us to take a look at this and think about what it means for what Martin is saying.
Came, and for a generation Westeros suffered from a harsh winter and darkness. In the uttermost north, a race of strange creatures known as the Others, or White Walkers, marched south against the realms of Westeros. Stories describe them as tall and gaunt, with skin as pale as milk, and eyes that shine bright blue. They wore camouflage armor and wielded razor-thin swords of ice, imbued with magic, allowing them to freeze and break enemy armaments. They were also able to summon ice spiders and raise the dead, riding reanimated horses, bears, and direwolves into battle, and reviving fallen enemies to create an army of undead warriors known as Whites. For years, they wreaked havoc across the land, until the legendary Last Hero journeyed deep into the north, possibly wielding dragon steel, in search of the children of the forest, recruiting them to help humanity in their struggle. As the war continued on, an organization known as the Night's Watch formed to fight against the invaders.
Okay, so that's a lot of information to throw at you all at once. So we have this dark force of ice creatures who are moving south from the cold north. Some human heroes who are rising up to try and defend. And this would be very in line with a lot of what Tolkien's doing, right? I mean, Mordor and Gondor and all of that. Like, you can kind of see some similarities there in the way that the story's played out, at least so far. Interesting fact about the Children of the Forest: they were actually at war with the first men. And if you find this video and watch it, you can kind of see this happen in the Dawn Age that he has right up there on the screen. They were at war with the first men who came over to Westeros and kind of colonized it. And so the Children of the Forest are this indigenous race that have been very badly mistreated by the human beings. And so now this hero rises up and recruits them to fight the White Walkers. That's a really interesting fact. Now, I'm going to keep playing the video. We'll see some interesting things happen with that I think also point to something that Martin's doing that Tolkien isn't necessarily.
achieving victory at the Battle for the Dawn. The others were then pushed back to the lands of always winter, not seen again in the south for over 8,000 years. Although stories say the children of the forest fought alongside humans during the long night, some believe that it was in fact the children who originally created the others in a magical ritual years earlier, with the intent of raising a powerful army to fight on their behalf against the first men, only to lose control of their creation. While Westeros suffered greatly during these years of war.
So, the children of the forest actually created the evil because they were trying to resist the colonizing force of the first men. So he's actually doing some really interesting sociological stuff that I think is kind of pointed at a lot of the rhetoric that we've had in our culture over the last 5-10 years or so. Just because you resist something that's genuinely evil doesn't mean that you don't also create a monster. And that, I think, is really, really interesting. But at the same time, what we see here is this dark force isn't a dark spiritual force necessarily. It's a dark political force. And so he's reduced the cosmic down to the cosmic Manichaean, you could say, down to and the dark side of that, down to a political battle. All of it becomes a political struggle because, at least theoretically, and we see this happen in the show directly, that animated scene that he cut up there, that was something from the show that happens in the show. It's vague in the book. Of course, he hasn't finished the series yet. So, anyway, this cosmic scope gets kind of reduced down to the political, which is, I think, a very interesting move and something that we won't see happen in Tolkien. I'll let him finish up maybe another minute or two, because now we're going to move out of Westeros, and we're going to see some of the ways that the battle's happening in Westeros, but the long night, the darkness that lasts for days and days, maybe years and years, I don't remember, affects the entire world. And so Essos, this other continent to the east, it handles this whole situation in a very different way by the development of many different mythologies that surround this event.
War and darkness. The devastation of the long night was felt all across the known world, seeing the lands of Essos endure their own hardships, establishing their own legends and mythos concerning the events of these years. In the lands of the Rhoynar, stories say a terrible night fell upon the world, causing the waters of the river Rhoyne to freeze, until a hero emerged to unite the children of the goddess mother Rhoyne to sing a secret song which brought back the day. Beyond the Bone Mountains in the great empire of the Dawn, legends say it was under the reign of the Amethyst Empress that the troubles began. Believing she was betrayed by her brother who crowned himself the Bloodstone Emperor, his corruption led him to turn his back on the gods of their people and worship a black stone fallen from the sky, causing the Maiden Maid of Light to turn her back on the world. This then led to the Long Night, when the Lion of Night came forth to punish the realms of men for their wickedness. The demon armies of this vengeful god caused great devastation until a hero emerged, wielding the sword Lightbringer to drive the enemy back, restoring light to the world. The story of a hero who fought the armies of darkness with a flaming sword spread throughout eastern Essos, with many cultures adopting their own version of the tale, such as the patrimony of Hirkun and its successor realms, who claim the man was known as Hirkun the Hero, while other lands give this figure names such as Eldrick Shadowchaser, Yin Tar, and Nefarion. The most well-known story, however, came out of the mysterious far eastern city of Ashai, where the followers of the Red God R'hllor claim the hero was Azor Ahai, believing he forged his magical sword by driving it into his wife's heart, imbuing it with her soul, and naming it Lightbringer, the Red Sword of Heroes. The ancient prophecies of Ashai then go on to claim that this ancient hero would one day return, reborn to fight against a new darkness that threatens humanity. The chaos of the years of war led to the collapse of the great empire of the Dawn.
Alright, so there's a lot going on there, and I mainly play all of that in order to demonstrate that there are a lot of different mythologies that develop in his world surrounding this one singular event. And that's, first of all, I mean, it's very realistic. That happens in the world in which we live. And so he's definitely going for a kind of realism that I don't think Tolkien is, and a realism that I can definitely appreciate. Like, I'm sympathetic to that, and I think it's very interesting. One of the reasons why I enjoy his stories. Now, that being said, one of the things that develops from that is a kind of moral and theological confusion. And that is compounded with the moral confusion that we've already discussed. So I'll leave that on the table. The thing that I want to point out here is that all of these different competing stories then spin out into consequences, mainly this last one he was talking about. This guy Azor Ahai, it's foretold that Azor Ahai will return. One of the interesting things, right, is he's supposed to be the bringer of light. His sword's called Lightbringer, but his sword is crafted with power by killing his wife, driving his sword through her heart, bathing it in his blood, which then gives it its magical powers that allows him to defeat the darkness. And so the defeat of evil or the darkness via the light isn't accomplished through a moral means. Definitely not that. If anything, it's moral, it's morality, it's amoral. There's no morality involved in the story at all. At worst, it's immoral in the sense that it involves the murder of a loved one in order to gain power enough to conquer the genuine evil, the force of death that's coming against you. So one of the things that I think is, see, that's the mythology that you kind of hear sprinkled throughout the world that's operating behind these people, the red priests and red priestesses, one of which we'll encounter in just a moment. And it's that mythology that then animates their efforts when it comes to battling the White Walkers in the story, this force that has returned to take over the world, and it also animates a lot of the political decisions that get made. So Stannis Baratheon, brother of the king who died in the first book and whose death kind of catalyzes this giant war, this attempted political power grab by a ton of different factions that kind of takes up a significant amount of the story. He's the true heir, or at least the true heir via his brother, if certain things are the case. We'll get into some of those things later. He is marching south, and he's been advised by a red priestess from Ashai who believes in this mythology of Azor Ahai and believes that he, Stannis Baratheon, this new king, is the living embodiment, the return of this king. And I use that term maybe deliberately, given how Tolkien sees the return of the king, right? And so the question of the return of this king, Azor Ahai, and the identity of this figure is one that kind of streams through the entirety of the story. And there's a decent bit of confusion about who this king is. We'll see that in a moment. But the thing that I want to point out here is Melisandre, this red priestess, convinces Stannis Baratheon to sacrifice his daughter in order to confirm victory for a battle the following day. So we're about to open up on a scene where he's upset with her because he did sacrifice his daughter at her advice. And he's about to get some bad news related to the sacrifice of his daughter. And the way that this operates, one, this is kind of based on, I think it's a Greek tragedy. But the way that we see the morality and the divine command mix in this scene, I think, is really fascinating. So I'll shut up, I'll play it, and then we'll go from here.
Your Grace, prepare to form up. Your Grace.
Tell me.
The men. Many deserted before dawn.
How many?
Nearly half. All the sell swords with all the horses. Your Grace.
That Stannis Baratheon, the woman who was standing next to him, is Melisandre. The soldiers desert because this leader chose to sacrifice his daughter in order to secure victory, and so they no longer believe in him as a competent leader. And so the Martin's doing a very weird thing, right? The lack of morality from the god supposed to give him power, and so far it actually has in the story. But this is when everything falls to pieces for him, when he pushes maybe one step too far. And so alignment with a deity doesn't actually guarantee you anything, one. Two, alignment with that deity doesn't mean you're being moral. And though it's supposed to get you power, sometimes it doesn't. And this soldier right here, I won't play the rest of it because it actually gets somewhat gruesome. This soldier right here who's talking to him is about to tell him that his wife has, is no longer alive at her own hand, and that is a direct consequence of his actions in killing his daughter. Though she was actually more fanatic about the Raelor, the sun, the fire god, the god of light, and the Lord of Light, I think is the term that's used. And so she was more fanatic about this god, but when it comes to the death of her daughter, she breaks. And then Stannis loses everything, including the battle that happens later that day. So now I'm going to fast forward us to a very different time. This is after he loses the battle and his life. And now Melisandre, that Red Priestess, she has decided to shift her allegiance. She no longer serves him, of course, because he's dead. She is considering Jon Snow to be the true Lord of Light. And so she's going to have a conversation with Davos, who is one of the characters who served Stannis and loved Stannis' daughter. And we'll see what they have to say about the identity of this Lord of Light, whether or not there is actually one.
Will you stay here at Castle Black?
I will do as Jon Snow commands.
You serve Jon Snow now?
He's the prince that was promised.
The prince that was promised is the term for this returning king, Azor Ahai, coming back.
Forgive me, my lady, I'd thought that was Stannis.
She did too. And that's Davos's point. See, in Game of Thrones, there isn't really any clarity about what the gods are doing, if there are any. So maybe we'll start there. If there are any, what they're doing. If what they're doing is right. She's now switched allegiance to Jon Snow because she believes he's actually been resurrected by her hand because he died for being a good person. We'll get into that later. Just like his father, Ned Stark. And he's killed, he's resurrected by her via the power of the Lord of Light. So he has genuine power. At least something has genuine power. And now she serves him because of that. She believes that he's the prince that was promised. She later is banished by Jon because Jon doesn't like the things that she does. This lack of morality gets her cast out. And he says that if he ever sees her again, that she will die. And so she goes to Daenerys Targaryen, another character who is conceiving of herself as the rightful heir and potentially this prince or princess in the native language of the story and of that prophecy. That term is genderless, and so it can go in either direction, and they make quite a big deal about that. And so she's claiming to be the princess that was promised, and so Melisandre follows her. And so there's, within the way that the story operates, just along those lines, there's a massive question about who the identity of this person is, and no clarity about it whatsoever. And then, to cap it all off, we find out that it doesn't really matter. So Melisandre has no idea who this prince that was promised is, and is willing to serve a variety of different people in order to try and discover who she thinks they are. She has real power, theoretically given to her by the Lord of Light. And this prince that was promised, the thing that he or she is supposed to do is defeat the realms of darkness, particularly the Night King, who is the figure who leads the White Walkers and their whites. And in the Long Night, which is the return of this Long Night that we heard about in that video in the origin story, in the Long Night is this giant battle between the forces of the living led by Jon Snow, who's teamed up with Daenerys Targaryen and a bunch of other people, and the forces of darkness, which is just the Night King and his zombie horde, basically. The moment comes down to this, and Jon Snow is currently pinned by an undead dragon who's about to kill him, and the Night King is about to kill Bran Stark, Jon Snow's half-brother, at least theoretically, his half-brother. Again, identity of Jon Snow is kind of up in the air. And so we're expecting that either Daenerys or Jon is going to kill the Night King somehow, right? Because they are the two kind of contenders for this prince that was promised. And if you read the prophecy, their identities both make sense with this figure. But neither of them actually fulfill the prophecy. Neither of them do it. So let's play. That's the Night King about to kill Bran Stark, who's like the force of life, because he is in. He has this power that lets him basically be omniscient. He's clairvoyant. He can see all over the place, and so he's the force of life. Again, we'll talk a little bit about that in a very later episode. Okay, so the person who killed the Night King isn't Jon, who we saw being attacked by the dragon. It isn't Daenerys, who's the other person who it's prophesied about. We didn't see her at all. It's Jon Snow's half-sister, who is Arya Stark. And so, completely out of left field, we're going to do a whole character analysis about Arya later, and so I'll leave that piece kind of aside. But the thing that I want to point out is none of what was prophesied in any regard, actually, related to the political situation too, but specifically in regard to the tension between life and death revolving this cosmic battle. None of that comes true. None of it. And John is actually the prince that was promised. You figure that out based on some revelations about his legacy that had actually happened already. And none of the things that were prophesied about that figure come true at all. Arya is the one who kills the Night King, and she defeats him via her kind of Nietzschean rise to power. Again, we'll talk about that specifically in a later episode, but I wanted to play the clip because I think it's very important the way that it demonstrates how, for Martin, prophecy doesn't actually come true. The moral confusion piece that we see with Stannis and his interaction with the gods, attempted grasp for power isn't related to morality. Morality sometimes is related to success, but sometimes not. And so it's like you stuck all of these elements in a blender, blended them together, and what you end up getting is kind of a gray, rather bland, though sometimes flashy, paste. There's zero actual commitment to a moral stance or to any kind of fulfillment of anything. John, spoiler, doesn't sit on the throne, the Iron Throne, at the end of the story, and he doesn't defeat the forces of darkness. And so the things that he was literally bred to do, he doesn't. And it leaves his storyline feeling, well, like a cheat, to be honest, and is incredibly dissatisfying. But beyond that, it's actually kind of disheartening, because the point of all of this is that none of these things actually make a difference at all. Now, that's where Martin lands. Let's talk about Tolkien. So I'm going to read about a page or two from the Silmarillion, and we'll talk a little bit, and then I'm going to play a clip from the Lord of the Rings. So this passage that I'm going to read comes from, let me see if I can find it. There we go. It comes from the first chapters. This is on page 4 of my volume of the Silmarillion. This is the creation story behind the world. So this is kind of the equivalent of that Game of Thrones lore video that I showed you earlier. It's going to paint a bit of the story behind the story for us. Now, Ilúvatar is the name of the god of Tolkien's universe. There's a single god. He has basically what are angels. They're the Ainur, is what they're called. And the head of the Ainur is Melkor. And Melkor does some interesting things. So this is the process of the world of Middle-earth being created. So let's read. But now Ilúvatar sat and hearkened, and for a great while it seemed good to him, for in the music there were no flaws. So Ilúvatar has started this chorus of the Ainur singing, and they don't really know why they're singing yet, but he has started them singing, and there's no flaw in the music, and that's important. But as the theme progressed, it came into the heart of Melkor to interweave matters of his own imagining that were not in accord with the theme of Ilúvatar. So Ilúvatar establishes the theme from the get-go, and Melkor decides to, in some sense, rebel. He wants to use his own imagination to come up with new things to pitch into the song. For he, Melkor, sought therein to increase the power and glory of the part assigned to him. So the Ainur are forming this chorus, this choir. And if you know anything about a choir, there are different sections, your bass and your tenors and your altos and all of that. And it's very important for each person to participate in the section of the choir that they are in the way that is appropriate for that section, because it is in the coming together of all the different voices that all of the impurities are overridden, and a beautiful song is then sung. I can not sing very well, but if I'm singing in a choral situation, I don't sound horrible, or at least as horrible as I would otherwise. And that's proof that it works. To Melkor, among the Ainur, so he desired to increase the power and glory of the part assigned to himself. So he is one part of this giant choir, but he doesn't want to just be one part. He wants to take his part and push it up a little bit. So to Melkor, among the Ainur, had been given the greatest gift of power and knowledge, and he had a share in all the gifts of his brethren. So he already is a more spectacular exemplar among the Ainur than any of the others. He's already on a pedestal, but he wants to just a little bit higher, right? And he had a share in all the gifts of his brethren. He had gone often alone into the void places, seeking the imperishable flame. For desire grew hot within him to bring into being things of his own. And it seemed to him that Iluvatar took no thought for the void, and he was impatient at its emptiness. So he doesn't like the fact that they currently live in the void of space, and he wants something interesting to happen. And so he seeks what's called the imperishable flame, which gives you the power to create. And through that, what he wants to do is create things of his own, not things of Iluvatar, not things in not the song in the chorus that he's supposed to sing among his brethren. He wants to create something of his own. And it seemed to him that Iluvatar took no thought of the void. So Iluvatar doesn't seem to care that the void is empty. And he was impatient at its emptiness. Yet he found not the fire, for it was with Iluvatar. But being alone, he had begun to conceive thoughts of his own, unlike those of his brethren. So the solitude, the lack of being in community with those around him, actually twisted him a little bit. Some of these thoughts he now wove into his music, and straightway discord arose about him, and many that sang nigh him, next to him, grew despondent, disturbed. And their thought was disturbed, and their music faltered. But some began to attune their music to his rather than to the thought which they had at first. So some get concerned and they stop singing altogether because they're confused. And some adjust their tune off of Iluvatar's and onto Melkor's. Then the discord of Melkor spread ever wider, and the melodies which had been heard before founded in the sea of turbulent sound. But Iluvatar sat hearkening until it seemed that about his throne there was a raging storm as of dark waters that made war upon another in an endless wrath that would not be assuaged. Then Iluvatar arose, and the Ainur perceived that he smiled, and he lifted up his left hand, and a new theme began amidst the storm, like and yet unlike the former theme, and it gathered power and had a new beauty. So Iluvatar sees all this discord happening, and he alters his theme to make something that's more powerful and more beautiful. But the discord of Melkor rose in uproar and contended with it. And again there was a war of sound more violent than before. So notice there was a war of sound caused by Melkor's rebellious sound. Iluvatar adjusts his so that it kind of smooths everything over. Melkor doesn't like it, and so he adjusts again to try and continue causing this violent chaos. But the discord of Melkor arose again and contended with it, and again there was a war of sound more violent than before, until many of the Ainur were dismayed and sang no longer, and Melkor had the mastery, so he shuts them up and takes control. Then again Iluvatar arose, and the Ainur perceived that his countenance was stern, so this time he's getting angry. And he lifted up his right hand, and behold, a third theme grew amid the confusion. It was unlike the others. For it seemed at first soft and sweet, a mere rippling of gentle sounds in delicate melodies. But it could not be quenched, and it took to itself power and profundity. It's powerful and it's profound. This new theme. And it seemed at last that there were two musics progressing at one time before the seat of Iluvatar, and they were utterly at variance. The one was deep and wide and beautiful, but slow and blended with an immeasurable sorrow. So it's beautiful, but sorrowful. It's a eucatastrophe, as we've talked about. It's one of the ways that Tolkien weaves it into his story. In fact, here he's seeing it as a metaphysical principle that is a precondition for creation. The other had now achieved a unity of its own, but it was loud and vain and endlessly repeated. All that Melkor can do is create a loud, somewhat unified, but repetitive tune, because that's all he can come up with. And it had little harmony, but rather a clamorous unison, as of many trumpets braying upon a few notes. So it's like just a few notes being played. So it has a kind of unity. But it's just noise. It's just sound. It's not music. And it essayed to drown the other music by the violence of its voice. And it seemed that its most triumphant notes were taken by the other and woven into its solemn pattern. In the midst of this strife, wherefore the halls of Iluvatar shook, and a tremor ran out into the silence, yet unmoved. Iluvatar arose a third time, and his face was terrible to behold. Then he raised up both hands, and in one chord, deeper than the abyss, higher than the firmament, piercing as the light of the eye of Iluvatar, the music ceased. One more paragraph. So Iluvatar stops it all during Melkor's rebellion. Then Iluvatar spoke, and he said, "Mighty are the Ainur, and mightiest among them is Melkor. But that he may know, and all the Ainur, that I am Iluvatar, those things that ye have sung, I will show them forth, and ye may see that what ye have done. And thou, Melkor, shalt see that no theme may be played that hath not its utmost source in me, nor can any alter the music in my despite. For he that attempteth this shall prove but mine instrument in the devising of things more wonderful, which he himself hath not imagined." And so what Iluvatar is saying there is that it doesn't matter how much you rebel. I will turn your rebellion into something that will glorify me and be good for my people. And what he shows them, right? One of the reasons Melkor wanted to do this is because he was bored with the void. And what Iluvatar ends up showing them is that the music that they were singing was actually creating things in the void. And had Melkor been patient, he would have seen that. But he wasn't patient. He missed it. And his rebellion cost him everything. This is a very different way of portraying a mythology. And it seems like some of the characters, particularly Gandalf in The Lord of the Rings, know something about this. We'll get into the providential piece in a minute. But that That piece, I think, is really important. Providence is being seen through this. Iluvatar's going to work out all of these things, any and everything that Melkor does in Rebellion, to be some kind of good. It doesn't mean that it's good in and of itself. It's actually chaotic and clamorous. But Iluvatar's not going to leave it that way. It may introduce some sadness because of the rebellion, but that sadness will become a eucatastrophe. It will be good in the end. And that is very different from the warring power struggle of the Game of Thrones. The attempt to sacrifice and outplay and garner the gods' support in order to win, but then be deserted, switch allegiances because things are happening and you're not sure who the real person to follow is. All of that is chaos. All of that is much more like Melkor's song, playing the same note or a few different notes, but it sounds like clamoring noise. So now to finish, I want to play one of the most profound scenes from The Lord of the Rings, and then I'll read a quote from one of Tolkien's letters. So this, many of you, if you are familiar, will likely recognize this scene. We're in Moria, and Frodo and Gandalf are about to talk about Gollum and about Frodo's role in the story.
There's something down there.
It's Gollum.
Gollum.
He's been following us for 3 days.
He escaped the dungeons of Barad-dûr.
Escaped. Or was set loose. And now the ring has drawn him here. He will never be rid of his need for it. He hates and loves the ring, as he hates and loves himself. Smeagol's life is a sad story. Yes, Smeagol, he was once called, before the ring found him. Before it drove him mad.
It's a pity Bilbo didn't kill him when he had the chance.
Pity? It was pity that stayed Bilbo's hand. Many that live deserve death, and some that die deserve life. Can you give it to them, Frodo? Do not be too eager to deal out death and judgment. Even the very wise can eschew ends. My heart tells me that Gollum has some part to play yet, for good or ill, before this is over. The pity of Bilbo may rule the fate of men.
I wish the ring had never come to me. I wish none of this had happened.
So do all who live to see such times, but that is not for them to decide. All we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given to us. There are other forces at work in this world, Frodo, besides the will of evil. Bilbo was meant to find the ring, in which case you also were meant to have it. And that is an encouraging thought.
In that scene, we not only see moral clarity, we see forces of good and evil. We see Frodo actually kind of align himself with the evil in the sense that he doesn't want to show pity, to show mercy on Gollum, which he later ends up doing. And to Gandalf's point, Bilbo and then later Frodo's pity, their mercy, is one of the things that contributes to the downfall of evil. And all of this, Gandalf sees as providential. Fundamentally. He sees it as ordered by something that is beyond Frodo's power, beyond Gollum's power, beyond Sauron's power. Iluvatar. He doesn't say it. God isn't being preached and screamed at your face. But in the nature of the story itself, something is being hinted at, is being more significant than the mere whims of power. Now, to close, I want to read something about Frodo's ultimate victory from Tolkien in his reflections on his own story in one of his letters. I believe this is letter 246 in a collection of a collected volume of his letters. He talks about Frodo's failure not being a moral failure. That's thing number one, right? Frodo does end up failing, right? He doesn't complete the quest. What ends up completing the quest is the mercy that he shows on Gollum that then ends up creating the situation for Gollum to take the ring to its ultimate destruction and let evil destroy itself, right? And so Frodo does contribute in that way to the victory of the good. But beyond that, so it's not a moral failure on Bilbo's part, because, and the reason it's not for Tolkien is that what he sees is going on here is Frodo spent his will to the utmost. And just like you can run out of physical strength, you can run out of willpower. And Frodo ran out of willpower. And that lack of willpower doesn't constitute necessarily a moral failure. It demonstrates your finitude as a creature. And so he doesn't think that Frodo morally failed. So that's thing number one. I do not think that Frodo's was a moral failure. At the last moment, the pressure of the ring would have reached its maximum. Impossible, I should have said, for anyone to resist, certainly after long possession, months of increased torment, and when starved and exhausted. Frodo had done what he could and spent himself completely as an instrument of providence, and had produced a situation in which the object of his quest could be achieved. So he actually did something substantive and good. His humility, with which he began, and his suffering were justly rewarded with the highest honor, and his exercise of patience and mercy towards Gollum gained him mercy in his failure. So, that's thing number one. It wasn't a moral failure. Frodo's mercy on Gollum is able to create this situation, but one of the things that I think is under-recognized about the story is that Frodo actually got really, really close to redeeming Gollum himself. And the thing that kind of did it all in was actually, I think, one, it was the capturing of Gollum by Faramir's men and the way that Frodo had to save him from them. But the way that looked, it twisted Gollum's sight of his master, right, of Frodo. And so he could no longer see that Frodo had his best interest at heart. But then secondly, and I think more subtly, Samwise, his mistreatment of Gollum and his suspicion of Gollum, which was rightly placed, but his mistreatment of Gollum actually produces a hardness of heart in Gollum that he can't overcome. And so I think Sam is the reason why Gollum isn't redeemed, to be honest. And that should be a warning to all of us that our actions do actually have consequences for the way that people, at least if we're Christians, see our God. So then, Tolkien talking about the situation with Gollum and the way that Gollum being restored by Frodo over the course of time, and how Sam's hatred and suspicion and mistreatment hinder that redemption. So then Tolkien says, certainly at some point, not long before the end, he would have stolen the ring, Gollum being he, or taken it by violence. So that thing was probably going to happen because Gollum had been totally captured by the ring, as he does in the actual tale. So that's Tolkien's admission. Like, that was probably going to happen regardless. But possession satisfied, I think, this is Tolkien, I think he, being Gollum, would have sacrificed himself for Frodo's sake and have voluntarily cast himself into the fiery abyss. Gollum would have been redeemed and then sacrificed himself. So still, even then, sacrifice, mercy, moral goodness end up producing the very things that bring about the destruction of evil. So instead of this blended gray mush of moral, power-grabbing, political maneuvering, we have an ordered universe, cosmologically, that mediates itself down into the realities of the story, that depicts to us moral clarity, providential guidance, and the love and care of the divine. And that, I think, is a big deal. These differences are a big, big deal. And I don't think that we can... I think that we should engage both stories, but I think that we should recognize what either story is doing to us and the message that the story is trying to push into us. One of these I hope to be true. The other I hope is not.